I'm John Friedman. I'm based in Washington, D.C., where I lead global government affairs for GE's water business. Today we're going to talk about the challenges faced by the United States in water. Dan, I enjoyed your remarks very much. Thank you. Manu, thank you for having us here. According to McKinsey and Company, 5 years ago, the world reached a tipping point where freshwater demand exceeds supply. And Manu, where are you, Manu? I think your remarks bore that out. And I also think we're seeing this imbalance play out in headlines across the world. In Brazil, a country with 13% of the world's freshwater resources, the taps are running dry in Sao Paulo. And in China, the Ministry of Land and Resources just released a study showing that in 60% of the cities it is monitoring, the groundwater is too polluted to drink. And, well, I'm off. But anyway, here in the U.S., in California, of course, the focus of today, the U.S., Manu, you touched on California quite a bit. They are in the fourth year of their worst drought in the past 500. So, to help us unpack these challenges, we have really an incredible panel today, and I'm going to introduce them to you now. They'll each make brief 5-minute remarks. I'll ask them a few questions, and then we're going to open it up to you. And I'm going to start with Nancy Stoner. Now, like me, Nancy is a graduate of the University of Virginia. Number 2 ranked basketball team in the nation. Unlike me, Nancy, I think you actually did well at UVA. Nancy went on to get a law degree from Yale. And then she headed the Office of Water at US EPA until recently, and now is the director of the water program at the Pisces Foundation. Then we're going to hear from John Young. John was the chief operating officer at American Water, the nation's largest investor-owned water utility, and today is a water management consultant. Then we'll hear from Vince Tidwell. Vince is a senior scientist at Sandia National Lab. He's also one of the world's leading experts on the energy-water nexus. And when Vince talks, I take notes. I always learn something. And then we have Jeff Buswick. Jeff is at Standard & Poor's, where he leads the Public Housing and Infrastructure Group for U.S. Finance. And he's the money guy. So he's going to talk about how we add money to this equation. And Nancy, let's start with you.
Great. Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you for the opportunity to be here. This is an amazing group of people and very interesting collection of ideas and so forth already today. So I'm really looking forward to the whole day here. As John said, I want to do just a little bit of introduction of the Pisces Foundation because my guess is probably a lot of you actually have never heard of it before and don't know what it is. So it's only been in existence since 2012. And Pisces, the name actually comes from the trustees' names, Bob and Randy Fisher. So it isn't about marine life. It's just a riff on their names. But it does do environmental philanthropy. And it works in 3 areas. Environmental education. There we're trying to focus on environmental education in K through 12 and making sure that we're increasing environmental literacy by having environmental education be part of what every student learns in their science classes. Climate is the second program, and we're focused on short-lived climate pollutants, methane, HFCs, black carbon, that kind of thing. And then the third program is water, and I am the water program director. And I have been there only since September, so I have a lot to learn. So those of you who know about philanthropy, please catch me at the break so you can tell me what I'm supposed to be doing. But the foundation is focused on the mission, people and nature thriving together. And the water program is primarily focused on changing the system of management in the United States to integrated water management. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So I also have slides with headlines. They seem to be popular already today. I guess we're all preaching to the choir here about the fact that this is actually a problem we need to focus on. Water, it presents itself in different ways. Mine are from the U.S. The program at the Pisces Foundation is U.S. focused. And different things that we've had there, including the algae and the problems in Toledo last summer, including the drought, which the California drought has been mentioned several times already, including, I think the top one is Superstorm Sandy. Wherever you are, you're seeing the impacts of climate on water, you're seeing the infrastructure issues that we've been talking about. They're being presented everywhere, and we really can't ignore them anymore. And I actually brought a prop. This, for those of you who haven't seen one recently, is a newspaper. These are an endangered species. And this is from my last trip to San Francisco, which is where the Pisces Foundation is headquartered. And it was just last week, and the top headline above the fold states snow levels reach historic lows. So think of all the things that were happening in the world last week, and that's the top headline in the paper. And so that provides, not just a challenge, but an opportunity, I think. We really do have people's attention here in the United States as well as globally. And so a group of people like us with the intellectual capital, with the resources we have at our disposal, we can really do something with that attention and interest for future generations. So that is our challenge today. Everyone's offering a challenge. That one's mine. Next slide. So my map is a little bit different than Monty's map, but mostly different, I think, in Texas and Florida, as I was looking at his versus mine. The map down there is from something I actually worked on in the job that I had before the job at EPA, which was at the Natural Resources Defense Council, where I was co-director of the water program there with David Beckman, who's now my supervisor at the Pisces Foundation. And this looked at water availability and water use and compared the two and saw the stress associated with that, and then factored in climate. The analysis was done by Tetra Tech, and it's received a lot of attention. John didn't go through all of the different effects that we see. But there's my list of different kinds of effects. I think it's pretty clear that a lot of them are linked to climate change, but they aren't solely linked to climate change. Certainly population growth, aging infrastructure, underfunded investments, and so forth are all relevant as well. But we have our work cut out for us. Next slide. So as I said, our focus at the Pisces Foundation is on integrated water management. And we've already had some discussion, I think, about the tension between how water presents itself differently in different places and the desire to try to have solutions that can work in multiple places and figure out how to do that efficiently without reinventing the wheel every single different place. And what we think is that integrated water management, because the focus, he's going to take the mic away, 30 more seconds.
Now that you're not head of water EPA anymore, I can say this. You're out of time.
All right, out of time. So let me just finish the sentence that I was on, which is that it shows you that, the idea is to look holistically and look long-term, and that can be done anywhere, even though the issues may be slightly different. And we think that you'll come up with better solutions by doing that. Thanks.
So I'm going to talk up here so John can't grab the mic.
I'll come up, John.
By the way, UVA is what, number 3?
He said 2. I don't know.
No, number 2 is Duke. That's my school. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. As you can tell from my introduction, I've spent about my entire career as a water and wastewater utility guy. And so when asked to talk about the water challenges and potential solutions in America, I basically went to my roots. What are the challenges of a water utility manager, and what do they need to confront every day? And I came up with a list here. It's not true for every utility, but it's my best shot. And none of these should surprise you. We have aging infrastructure. We have over 700,000 miles of pipe in the ground. in the U.S. That's 4 times the length of the national highway system. And that pipe continues to deteriorate since we're not replacing at a rate compatible with the projected life of the pipe. Over the last 40 years, we've gone from about 10% of our pipe in poor condition to about 40%. We have issues with respect to supply and climate change. We've talked about that a lot. It impacts the adequacy of supply, the yield of supply, and the quality of both groundwater and surface water supplies. Regulatory requirements and new requirements have slowed down over the last couple of years, but we still have that challenge of where do we spend our money on enhanced treatment or on our buried infrastructure problems. We struggle to determine how much money we ought to be spending on system reliability, how much we ought to be spending on facility and cybersecurity as well. And one thing people don't think about too much is we have a changing customer. The customer of the utility is getting older, they're getting more health conscious, they're getting better educated, and they're getting more demanding. And I think that's a really good thing. At the same time, our workforce is getting a whole lot older, and they may or may not be able to implement some of the technical and innovative solutions that we're going to need to handle here. Now, even with all these challenges, the utility manager is also responsible for controlling cost, making sure the rate adjustments are minimal at best, and finding money in the financial markets to make investment in both regulatory and infrastructure improvements. Now, today we're going to spend a lot of time talking about emerging technologies and innovation approaches that we need to enhance America's water situation. And I guarantee you that there is a technical, a policy, or an equipment solution to every challenge that we come up with. The bigger question is, how are we going to pay for all of this? Next slide. The utility really has 2 choices of how they're going to pay for something. They can either get more efficient and get money that way, or they can raise rates. It's just as simple as that. We have a lot of tools to get more efficient at our plants through automation and things like that. Today we'll discuss a lot about the availability of water, how the availability of water could impact the growth of our energy resources. But we need to understand that that energy nexus goes both ways. About 3% of the domestic energy use is to move water and wastewater around the country. It's up to 20% when you go out to California. Therefore, it's important that we continue to have this partnership between the water industry and the electric industry to promote operating efficiencies and greener operations. On the capital side, the industry needs to first inventory its assets and then assess its assets, some of which has been in the ground for over a century, and then use the best technology and use the best management techniques to allow us basically to get the most bang for our bucks. We need to better prioritize where we're spending our money. And of course, one thing everybody talks about when they talk about efficiency in the water industry is consolidation. And we failed miserably at that. Over the last 45 years, the number of water systems in the country has increased by 30,000. That's tripled in size. We have over 50,000 water systems and 16,000 wastewater systems in the country. That compares to like 1,000 to 2,000 electric and gas utilities. So clearly we have a long way to go to get to the levels of economies of scale and expertise of scale that we actually need. But we're not going to get there alone on efficiencies. We're going to have to raise rates for water and wastewater. There's no question about it. Unfortunately, there are a number of barriers to that. I mean, the good news is that the typical customer, as was discussed earlier today, is using less water because of plumbing code changes, more efficient water devices, smaller family size, and just general conservation. So one of the challenges we have is convincing the public that even though you're using less, you're going to have to pay more. We need to get better at defining affordability criteria, very important, across customer classes as well as across various income levels. And I think we got to try to minimize the politics in water rates.
John, don't make me come up there.
Okay. Give me 30 seconds?
Okay.
Okay. Water rates like taxes. Nobody likes them. I've worked over the last 4 years in the 2 largest municipal bankruptcies in the country, one in Alabama, one in Detroit. In Alabama, they didn't raise rates for 6 years, even though they defaulted on $3.2 billion worth of debt. In Detroit, as Dan mentioned, they're marching in the streets to have affordable water, but over 10% of the water bills aren't being paid. And finally, we got to get better at cost of service and defining what the value of water. We really don't know what the value of water is, most of us, until we actually lose water service. So our challenges are many. Our solutions, they're there. We just need to figure out how to bring them together in a cost-effective way.
Thank you, John. And Vince, how does energy play into this equation?
Good question. Thank you. So, yes, energy water, although I don't start with it, and there should be some slides with the headlines, but energy water nexus has been making the headlines not only here in the U.S., but all over the world. And, well, what is the nexus? Well, that's the fact that we use a lot of water to produce energy. We also use a lot of energy to produce water. And do we have slides coming up? I don't know who. Well, anyway. Yes, there we are. So, the nexus. So let's start with the water for energy, and why is this such a big issue? Well, there in the top left corner, you can see that recently USGS, as always, does their projections of water use across the U.S. The energy sector withdraws more water than any other sector in the U.S. That whole gold part there, the pie, is just the energy sector, and you can see almost 50% of all water use is by the energy sector. Why do they use so much water? Well, actually, water touches every single aspect of the energy cycle, all the way from the construction of our facilities to the extraction of coal and oil and natural gas, to the processing of those fuels, whether it's biofuels or gasoline, requires water. And then and also transportation, barges moving coal up and down the Mississippi to slurry lines, and most importantly, cooling of our thermoelectric power plants, and that's where the lion's share of that water is used. You can see over there in the top right-hand side is where we use that water. And so as we've already talked a little bit about, water is local. This energy water nexus is local, and it depends on the area of the U.S. that you're in. It gives a very different character to what this interaction, this nexus looks like. Here you can see water use for thermoelectric power plants. Every different dot is a thermoelectric power plant. The blue dots, well, the color indicates the kind of cooling system that the power plant uses. And then the size of the dot represents how much water is withdrawn. And so you can see the big dots, the big blue dots, are all open loop cooling systems. They use lots of water, withdraw lots of water, basically just divert the river through the power plant to cool it down. And so you can see that's largely in the east or along the coast where there's lots of water. In the west, we have the little gold circles. Those are recirculating power plants where you pull the water out of the system and then you use evaporation to cool it off. You consume all of that water. So you're consuming much more than you're withdrawing, or consuming relatively much more than you would with a closed-loop system. So what you see here is that very different character in the types of cooling, very different character in the types of water use. In the West, where we don't have a lot of water, we consume a lot more water for thermoelectric power than we do in the East. So that's an issue. Looking forward, we just did a study with WEC, the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, and there we found that projecting forward just over the next 20 years, depending on the how the energy system evolves over time and the type of power plants that they're building, that the future consumptive demand for water and thermoelectric power could be anywhere from increasing by 35% to decreasing by 35 to 40% by the closure of a lot of coal plants. Another big issue that's looming is the water for oil and gas shale extraction. And there, a gas fracked well can take anywhere from 1 to 10 million gallons of water apiece. A play can have thousands of wells in a play. So we're talking about a fair amount of water. The other important thing, if you remember from Manu and others' graphics, that a lot of where these new plays are in the west, in the Mountain West, in Texas, California, these are places we don't have a lot of extra water, and water's at a premium. This is a new demand on our water use. And then finally, over there in the bottom right, is that we're already seeing impacts from energy or from water on the energy system. So from things like insufficient water for hydropower production during drought, wildfires driven by drought, which are impacting transmission. We have plants that can't be sited, new plants that can't be sited because there's insufficient water supply. We have problems with power plants in the east, the big open loop plants. The water's too warm for them to operate and their effluents affecting the environment. And extreme events damaging power energy facilities. So we have all of these things already happening today with the uncertainty in energy supply or climate change, these are going to get worse. Next slide. And I'm very close to being done. Here, again, we use a lot of energy for water, and these 6 different slides there on the left just show where we're using. And again, place really matters for things like large-scale conveyance, moving water across mountains, and you can see a lot of it like with the Central Arizona project there in the far southwest, the red areas, water to pump for agriculture. Then the lower 2 there on the left are drinking water and municipal wastewater. You add all that up, you can see that a very different footprint depending on where you're at, but every place is touched. We use some electricity for these water services. 6% on average of all electricity in the West go for these services, and it's only going to get worse as we do more desalination, more wastewater reuse, moving water from longer distances, and improve treatment for things like pharmaceuticals in the water.
Thank you,
And
Vince.
I'm done. Thank you.
First thing I want to say, that was great, thank you. That's first. Second thing I want to say is that we were limited to no more than 2 charts each. And I don't know if you noticed, Vince found a way to show 12 on 2 pages. Nicely done, Vince.
Make more with less.
Sandia National Labs, money, or taxpayer money at work, in a good way. Smart guys. And as important as energy is, at the end of the day, money is what it's all about. Jeff, you take us home.
Well, thanks, John. I have no slides. I think I loaned mine to Vince, and so he could take advantage. It's interesting being called the money guy. At Standard & Poor's, what we try to do is share information for investors so they can make a better decision, right? We are trying to let people know if an investment is creditworthy, to the extent of the willingness and ability of that borrower to repay the debt on time in accordance with the bond documents. In my group, we look at infrastructure and housing, and so we've talked a lot about how that interplays everything with water and between ports, power plants, the water supply, the wastewater. We look at SRFs to help fund that. We have about 1,600 water credits within that environment of the, 50,000 you mentioned that EPA has a community small providers. We don't have money. We are not necessarily the money guy. We try to make the efficient use of funds through the capital markets more transparent. And so that's a little bit of what I'll talk about, because we try to have that transparency in what we see as the risks associated with deals and associated with certain credit structures. One of the interesting aspects that we've had in the last 2 years is a charge from our president that there are 2 global macro issues that will affect credit no matter what you do. If you are a corporate issuer like a PepsiCo, how are you affecting these? If you're a bank with a financial institutions rating, how is it being affected? Our 2 issues are climate change and global aging. And I think there's a lot of interplay between the 2. And so we've been writing as much as we can about how our credit assessment, that ability for you to repay debt, could be impacted over time with those 2 global macro trends. Realistically, this is a shift for Standard & Poor's. It's something that we didn't have as such a focus in the past. And so having that micro focus and causes us not only in our committees, in our discussions with our issuers to talk about what these things mean, but also broadly as a company, how we should be affecting these. Coming back to water and the cost and the money, where it came from, think about where it came from in the past. Right? Historically, in the U.S., it has been funded by the federal government, the state government, or the local government. And so it's come from taxes or rates. How it's been funded, or how it comes to the rating agencies, is something that is of interest too. Water is something that is regularly funded with a broad diversity of security pledge types. The general obligation bond of a state, a city, a county can fund water. The rates themselves for enterprise funds can fund water. A lease structure, a special tax, a local option sales tax can fund. So there is money in different pockets. Now, 1.7 trillion, as Dr. Lau mentioned from the EPA study, or American Water Works study, it is substantial. How do you fund that? Our work and our analysis says is about, in infrastructure as a whole, about a $500 billion gap a year globally, and about a $236 billion gap in the U.S. for all infrastructure, water water being a component of that. So what we're seeing more recently are new ways to bring different types of capital in, because if there's this funding gap, where's it going to come from? And what we're seeing are public-private partnerships. I've yet to come across a true salivating investor, which I think was the wording on one of Dr. Lyle's slides. But there is great interest in water and greater information to go forward with it. Recently, we've been seeing bank loans come into play. Not the bank loans as we've seen to help fund small issuers in the past, but LADWP last year did a $500 million bank loan with a single bank. This is a remarkable change in the way projects are funded, because historically bank loans aren't transparent. No one knows what's in these documents, what the terms are, what other risks may be introduced in that. So we're talking as often as we can to make sure that bank loans, when they're used as a replacement for a public capital market issuance, are as transparent as possible so that the risk transfer information is there. And that's something we worry about. We see, now to give LADWP the credit, they did make that fully transparent. We got to write about it in our credit reports, and so we do appreciate their leadership as a major entity going to bank loans. And then you look for other things. Is the federal policy changes? Is WIFIA going to come in and make a difference if they ever get real funding? So two quick issues before I wrap up. One, in our broad view of S&P, what infrastructure can do, we just last week released a study. Our economic research, and so I'm reading this because it's new to me. Our economic research says spending just 1% of real GDP in the U.S., which equates to about $160 billion over 3 years, would boost economic output by about $270 billion over 3 years. It's about a $1.70 GDP over 3-year period for $1 of economic investment. This year alone, it could equate to 730,000 jobs. That's not inconsequential. So there's a cost, there's a liability, but there are benefits we can talk about of getting this done as well. Our benefit, we just released our new request for comment, closed last week, for how we would evaluate all water and sewer entities across. New measures that we've talked about today, operational management, how you manage drought, how you have capacity, financial, how you deal with policies, what you do, and then affordability. And we have new affordability measures we've never had before. So I'm happy to talk about more, and I think it'll aid in further transparency in the capital markets as we roll out this new piece of criteria for people. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, each of our panelists. Now we're going to ask a few questions. I'm going to ask a few questions, but we will leave time for you to ask a few questions too. And John, I'd like to start with you.
Uh-oh.
I didn't know you went to Duke. I'm sorry. But let's talk about climate change. And I think, you know, from an operating utility perspective, I mean, what does that mean? How do you deal with it?
It's very difficult to deal with because it's somewhat of an unknown. We look at climate change both from a quality and a quantity point of view. The quality point of view is somewhat obvious, you know, more extremes in weather, flooding, rising sea level and saltwater intrusion, all those are somewhat obvious. But probably what's more important is the quantity of water. Water utilities in the U.S. have to be 24/7. You know, you never go to your tap and don't find any water. So when we plan, we have to plan for our outages and restrictions. So the supply may be designed for 49 out of 50 years to be adequate. With the changing weather patterns, that adequacy changes. And so we have to make the big decision. Are we going to invest more in our supplies? Are we going to invest more in our treatment plant to increase capacity to maintain the same reliability level? Or are we going to reduce our reliability level? And what does the public, you know, what's acceptable to the public? So that's the big question on climate change.
I'm not supposed to do this, but I'm going to ask a follow-up question. So do you think about water reuse as a way to ensure adequate long-term supplies?
We definitely do, but this gets into the whole issue of cost effectiveness and you know, where can it cost effectively be used? Because once again, you may be only using this 1 out of 50 years, and it's not cost effective to do it that way.
Well, I think one of the big issues in water reuse is energy consumption. Vince, which brings me to you, and I guess the question from a climate change perspective, what's Sandia thinking about?
Well, certainly on the energy side, climate's a big issue. Like one of the graphs that I showed there, the U.S., we're already seeing impacts from climate on energy production in many different ways. And I think that's kind of the challenge here is with the energy sector is just all the different ways that climate impacts energy production and the regionality associated with that. In the West, you worry more about drought having, impacting the availability of physical water, whereas in the East, it's much more of an issue about the temperature of the water quality, and that limiting power production. In the Midwest, we worry more maybe about biofuels and changes in production of feedstocks there because of drought. So, and then damage, storm, wildfire, et cetera, have very different play out in different ways with climate. So it's kind of a mixed bag, and you have to have a real regional hat on to think about it.
And Nancy, this is a challenges panel, but challenges bleed over into solutions as well. And you talked about integrated water management. So I'm wondering, how does that play into addressing the whole climate change and other challenges?
Well, I think that we have spent a lot of time talking about the challenges here, but one of the things that I did get to do at EPA that was really enjoyable was to go around the country and see what various communities are doing to address these challenges. And as I alluded to before, I mean, it's a little different in different places. Some places it's rainwater harvesting, some places it's reuse, sometimes it's energy generation from sewage treatment. I mean, there's just a lot of innovation going on in the utility sector, in the local industry, and local governments. And I think that's a great opportunity. I mean, people are finding out how to make these things work, not just for water, but for water energy, for water food, for their economy, for quality of life, for public health, for aesthetics. And what we've got, whether we designed it this way or not, is a lot of experiments, essentially, across the country in different places where innovative people, have taken leadership to develop these solutions. I think we have a huge amount we can learn from each other on how to take these ideas, to tailor them so that they'll work in our community, working with the stakeholders, as we discussed earlier, to really make a big difference in people's lives.
Hey, Jeff, from a public-private partnership standpoint, what are you seeing and what do you think the prospects are for that to be a solution to some of these challenges?
In the muni bond industry, we've been having public-private partnership conferences so often. The joke in the industry that there are more conferences, actual deals that get done for sizable deals. And so it's been talked about as a tool to be used to aid for a long time. I would say for the water system, back the way I got into this was as a city administrator, having a design-build contract with a private operator to build a water treatment plant, and that's how I got familiar with a lot of the financing mechanisms. And so the water utility has been doing that, but what we're seeing more are these some social housing issues, some courthouses, some toll roads, where you have a design, build, operate concession, where someone comes in, suggests a problem, designs it, builds it, and then operates it for a long time. We've seen some be very successful, and I think that what we've seen is there's a mix of how you gauge success. Is it the project on time, on budget? We've seen those. Is it that within your concession you have very specific limits to what the project will be returned at, what quality standards are delivered for you, what maintenance will be done that you as a government entity may not have been able to provide in the past? But on the flip side, they're typically more expensive than those traditional ways of funding projects. Your muni bond is still one of the cheapest ways to access capital there are, and so there's a trade-off. If you have good controls and can access it through traditional measures, great. If not, maybe you can think about a public-private partnership for some of these longer measures, but ensure that you have the right controls and measures to get the return that you want from that project.
And John, as the former COO of the nation's largest investor-owned water utility, what are your views on this?
I have to agree. There are probably more conferences than there are projects. We've been talking about private-public partnerships, design, build, operate, all those things for years. The design-build industry has taken off. The public-private partnerships are really not. I mean, it's the whole same issue of consolidation and privatization. There's a recognized need to maybe to do some of that consolidation and privatization and share best practices and all of that, but in reality, it's just not happening.
Nancy, I know EPA doesn't play a role in public-private partnerships, not a formal role, but one of the things Manu mentioned was increasing regulation. And I know as the former head of water at EPA, that's something you're very familiar with. What are your thoughts on, well, first of all, what regulatory developments are we seeing, and what does that mean for the water world?
Well, one of the things that I worked on a lot at EPA was looking at aging statutes. So we're talking about aging infrastructure. Well, we also have aging statutes, the Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act, and really trying to figure out how to make them work for today's problems. That was one of the main things that I felt like was my responsibility, because I think that those statutes serve very important purposes. And it does disturb me a little bit to hear of them as talked about as barriers in a group like this, because they are drivers for a lot of the investment that we're talking about as well. But they're not multifunctional in the same way that my chart on integrated water management is. And so I think the key thing we all need to do together is to figure out how you take those important goals that are reflected in the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, how do you fit those into a broader scheme of the complexity of the challenge that we face today. And so that's what I tried to work on at EPA and what I will continue to work on at Pisces.
John, I think the combination of increasing regulations, which you might have some insight as to what specific regulations we're seeing, but the combination of increasing regulation plus aging infrastructure is probably something that's a great challenge to operating water utilities.
Yes, I mean, if you take a look at the 70s and the 80s, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the various enhanced surface water treatment rules, things such as that, there was a lot of investment in plant and enhanced treatment in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. And most of the research, if you look at the research that was being done, it was being done on disinfection byproducts, membranes, enhanced treatments, a number of things such as that. During that period of time, we essentially neglected our buried infrastructure. Now, fortunately, EPA slowed down a little bit, but we have to catch up. And we need to balance the investment in plant and the investment in this infrastructure. And the other thing we need to remember is that investment that we made in plant and enhanced treatment in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, that is now 20, 30 years old. And we're going to have to make reinvestment in that. And so that's the challenge. And the other thing we need to remember is leaky pipes can also result in public health problems. Mm-hmm. It's not all about taking contaminants out of water. It's what can come in through the leaky pipes. So we have to look at our infrastructure as also a public health threat.
Vince, you started to talk about this before I cut you off. And one of the things about energy is that it can be very water intensive to develop the sources of energy. You touched on shale. Is water a constraint for us in developing the energy resources we're going to need, and can it be addressed?
Yes, absolutely. It's a constraint. It's a growing constraint. As I mentioned, there are already cases where limited water availability has caused great problems with siting new power plants. There's been cases where droughts have caused limited production of shale and oil gas, oil and shale gas production. So there are cases that we're already seeing that happen. Going forward, well, in fact, I think another example was a study that I had mentioned where we recently worked with the Western Interconnection to look at different scenarios that they were looking at in terms of how they might build out, where they might build the next power plant. And as I mentioned, there's a big range of potential water demand and what that might look like across those different scenarios. But the upshot of all that, we also looked across the western United States, worked with the different state water managers to find out where they felt water was available. And for the most part, there's not a lot of surface and groundwater, fresh water available, water rights in much of the western United States. And so in order to meet these new demands for thermoelectric power, and there will be some, much of that's going to have to be met with some non-traditional waters, and we're already seeing that happen either through reuse of municipal wastewater or moving to brackish water or other kinds of sources. And so I think, there is water out there. We're just going to have to think about it a little differently, and there's a great opportunity for research to drive the energy use and the price of these non-traditional waters down.
So I think that's a very optimistic note on which we will open it up to questions from the audience. And your hand was up before we even opened it to questions. So we start. Is there a microphone that you want to bring, or you want to just talk loudly?
Thank you. Good morning. I think it was Vince who showed a chart, or you might have mentioned desalination and I know it's something that individuals are still talking about, but I want to refer to a chart that Professor Law had as it relates to energy consumption and where desalination is at the highest energy, whereas reuse is at the lowest. And it has been, I think that's what his chart showed.
Lower.
Yeah, lower. And it has been proven from Asia and India that recycling works. I mean, there was, and most recently, I think it was about a week ago, Bill Gates was drinking recycled water from one of his foundation projects, and it works. So why are we still talking about desalination in the short term, and maybe in the long term it may make sense, but then I don't know if there needs to be more research on it, but what's stopping us, Vince and John, from just making it happen? We know that it's doable, and it's been proven outside the country. So it ties into this whole best practice sharing. There are best practices from outside the U.S. that have been proven, and what's slowing us down from adopting, not cut and paste, but cut and adapt to the U.S.?
Sure, that's a great question in terms of reuse versus desal, and again, place really matters in this. The kind of you've got to look at the issue very closely, and I think what a big part of it is understanding the difference between consumption and withdrawal and reuse. I mean, reuse is a zero-sum game in the sense that, particularly out west, largely what we're doing is, so Albuquerque is like the fifth largest tributary to the Rio Grande below Colorado. So basically, Socorro, El Paso, everyone downstream depends on our wastewater discharge that is being reused. So that water, it's not new water. So it may not make sense to reuse that water. We really need to find a new source of water, and that's why desal in certain cases may be a better answer. And yes, you're right, it's really too energy intensive at this time. We need new research. I think there are opportunities to drive that down, but it's not, it's not going to be an incremental change. We need some real step changes looking outside the box to really, if we're really going to change the way desal looks, we've got to look at some other means. So again, place really matters, and you've got to look closely at the problem and know which options you really need to consider.
Yeah, from the utility side, first of all, there are not that many desal plants being built for potable water. I mean, desal is all around the country, but not much on the potable water side. The one thing that we're struggling with on the reuse side is, how shall I say it, a guarantee that this is what we're going to achieve with reuse. This gets back to the whole 24/7 reliability. If we're going to put all our cards on something like reuse as opposed to desal, even though desal is expensive, we know it's going to be there. We have to make sure that it, quote, works. Now, it does work from an economic perspective. We also need to make sure that the quantities, that we generate are also adequate. But you're going to see a whole lot more reuse and a whole lot less desal, unless desal gets less energy intensive. And there are ways to make it less energy intensive.
I think, the moderator, I'm going to answer anyway. I think one of the great obstacles to more reuse, so all this scarcity we're all talking about, and yet, what's the world reusing today? 3 to 4% of its wastewater? What's the U.S. reusing today? 5 to 6%? Yeah. What's California reusing today in light of the drought? 8 to 10%? Depends who you ask. Why not more? It's way cheaper than desalination, it uses way less energy, it's an available resource that's being discharged, partially treated into our nation's waterways. If you ask me, it's economics. And it's simply cheaper to take water from a river or the ground or even, John, potable municipal systems than it is to buy and implement reuse technologies. So I think it's a policy issue, and I think that governments are looking for and will find ways to promote greater reuse through things like more education and outreach, by removing barriers that exist today, like pricing schemes that don't make sense, by providing incentives, and in some cases through mandates, which we're seeing happen around the world as well.
Yeah, to reinforce that, John, you take a look at a state like Florida, where they probably have some of the highest reuse. When you go in to get an allocation permit in the state of Florida, before you can develop a new source, you have to prove that you can't reuse sufficient water to get it done, which is exactly why policy is driving more reuse in the state. So policy does have to step up.
And you have similar requirements for thermoelectric power in California, that you can't use fresh water or really have to be able to demonstrate that there are no other sources.
You have a microphone.
So,
I
yeah,
guess you're
I
next.
somehow got a microphone. I had a question for Jeff about cost of financing. So you made the comment that municipal financing is cheap relative to other sources of financing for a lot of these projects. So capital markets are efficient. Is it cheap with merit? Somebody's mispricing something.
Okay.
Either it's too cheap and they don't know what the risks are, or there are risks that the private market or the other sources of capital are pricing in that are overblown. So how do you square the debate between the abundantly cheap municipal financing and other sources of capital?
I think we are looking at a situation where we're trying to gauge different risks now through some of the lessons learned that John was involved with, Detroit Water and Sewer in Jefferson County and Birmingham. There were more risks than maybe originally thought. It's also a sea change that's happening in some of the public finance world, where in 2007, something like 55% of the market was bond insured. And so people would buy it thinking, oh, I'm just going to be repaid. I don't have to worry about the risks inherent. But now the risks are much more important, and so there's a shift. The users and the traditional investors in the muni finance have a lower expectation for return, but it's a smaller universe, and so that's some of the issues as well. The small universe has an appetite for maybe about $300 to $400 billion a year in public financings in the U.S., but the corporate world does trillions. And so what's the difference? How do you lure in to make sure there's more of a balance? And so that's some of the issues that we're looking at.
Yeah, but unfortunately, it gives a bad message to those people who have access to that cheap finance, that they can do things that maybe need a higher level of cost of capital because they are taking more risks than they're getting adequately compensated.
Well, I think, to tout us a little bit, the more we can get our assessment risk more transparent, the better. And then Professor Lal had the slide earlier, transparency in the capital markets in general, making sure that the price points and the price drivers are understood and transparent to all who may want to put their money in some of these projects is key, and it's probably currently not to the point where it should be.
We have a question in the back.
Thank you. This question is for the utilities and also for the former EPA speaker. To what extent is a shift toward renewable energy being looked at as a way to address the water issues associated with power generation?
Wait, I'm sorry. So, yes, renewables play a very big role in reducing water use for thermoelectric power production of wind, PV, solar, or not thermoelectric. So there's almost no water use associated with those, and that's part of what I was talking about with WEC. In the Western Interconnection, when you look at the future and how the evolution of the portfolio of energy technologies that you're using, so the mix between coal, nuclear, renewables, hydropower, et cetera, make a huge difference. And as I was saying, it can run anywhere from on the order of a 30% increase in the consumptive use of water in the thermoelectric sector in the West to a decrease, even with growth, a decrease in the overall water use by over 30%. And that just has to do with that mix of power. But at the end of the day, at least right now, we still have to have base loads, some kind of thermoelectric, so that almost all of it is natural gas. But the advantage there now is that the natural gas combined cycle is about half to a third of the water use of a conventional coal or nuclear power plant. So a lot of really good things are coming together to help that power industry drive down their water intensity. But again, it depends on what path they end up following of how quickly that will change.
From a utility basis, once again, it's all about making the business case. And for years, we were taking advantage of tax credits to take use of alternative energy sources. But we also have gotten a little creative. For example, take a look at solar and take a look at large reservoirs. Why not float solar farms on top of reservoirs, and what you get there is you get the solar power and you get reduced evaporation. So it's getting creative that will ultimately make the business case.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is that I did see really an increasing interest by DOE over the time I was at EPA in the energy water nexus, and they did a report, I think it was last fall maybe, on that topic. June, thank you, on that topic. And you know, DOE has a much larger budget to address these issues than EPA ever will. And so getting DOE interested in financing some of these solutions, I think, is a big opportunity for all of us.
I guess I should mention, being, you know, we're a DOE lab, so right now DOE is looking at this very closely. That was part of the reason they put this report together. They are looking to really increase the funding to research focused on this energy water nexus area, the solutions, talking about improved modeling so we can understand the vulnerabilities with climate change and what some of the trade-offs with putting these kind of innovative solutions together, to also looking at how we might drive down the energy intensity of non-traditional water, so making reuse and desal more cost-effective and energy-effective, and even, you know, pulling energy out of our waste stream. So a very broad program to try and touch on all of these, even policy and other issues like that as well.
Thanks.
We have a question in the back.
Yeah, which is great. I'm glad you just said that, because that was the line of questioning I was going. First of all, John, terrific assembly of industry experts in their fields. Thank you for moderating this. But we talked just now about seawater desalination is too expensive, not enough adoption of reuse. Nancy mentioned it earlier. You just mentioned it now, extracting energy from wastewater. I'd love to hear the panel talk more about that. How can we harness more energy from wastewater in order to drive more adoption of reuse, because of this issue we have with it costs more?
I guess, as I was saying, I've seen lots of people that are doing it, and they're doing it in different kinds of ways at wastewater treatment plants across the United States, and not just, you know, also extracting nutrients and other value out of sewage. But and there's lots of strategies. Some of them are you know, biogas-related strategies, other, you know, even hydrogen fuel and other kinds of things that people are doing. And so I think that, you know, the data I've seen, and I bet Vince knows it better than I do, shows that most of these plants can become energy neutral through extraction of that value. So that doesn't mean that they can sell back to the grid. That seems to be an additional level that sometimes takes outside waste to be brought in, like food waste that has higher BTU content. But I think it's achievable to have energy neutral sewage treatment plants in the United States, and we should figure out how to do that.
Yeah, and we're pretty far down the road on most, I'd say most of our wastewater plants in doing that.
I would mention, take it a little bit further too, is looking at the waste heat from the power production, and so again making use of you know, energy in different ways, and so thinking about either waste heat as a way of heating other kinds of processes, or another important place would be to use the waste heat off a power plant to run desalination. So all kinds of different opportunities out there for looking at technology and chaining them in different ways to meet these kinds of needs and offset energy and water use.
And I would just say this whole notion of extracting energy from wastewater seems to be the key to the kingdom to solving so many of the challenges that we're facing in water today. And there was a question right here.
Thank you. I'd like to pose a what if to all of you, or at least as many of you as want to take me up on it. What if water were reframed or even upgraded from an issue of infrastructure to homeland security or national defense, would that change any of the stuff that you've been talking about?
Let me just say, if you each want to respond, you have 30 seconds each.
So we do work with Homeland Security as well as DOE, and so we're looking at all these problems. And I think, I mean, it's a great question. I think what it boils down to is we need to be thinking, we need to be combining that way of thinking in terms of the physical security with the security to climate change, the security to water availability and growth. That all needs to be factored together in a ways to be able to make those assessments as we design and move our infrastructure ahead into the next 100 years. So,
I'll be real brief. I'm not sure you can fully protect a water system.
But at the same time, we've been seeing a lot of capital at both water and power plants for improving
Yes.
protections against potential events as well. So that's a major cost in the past decade that we've been seeing that people are issuing bonds for.
Right.
cybersecurity.
So yeah, as well, it's not just cyber, physical as well. Yeah,
Yeah, both. Yeah.
The only thing I would say is that EPA, they look at it as sort of an all hazards approach. I don't know what you mean by water security exactly, but the threat of terrorism or something is one risk, but there's lots of other risks, all of which are important and many of which the agency is working on.
We have time for one more short question. And you had your hand up first, I have to say.
Thank you. John, I wonder if you could talk about the receivership issue in Jefferson County, Alabama. Thank you. You mentioned the EPA monies for infrastructure, and that has dried up over the years, and now it's largely a loan program. So the concern is that these communities would be walking away from their responsibilities, not just on the wastewater side, but also on the drinking water side.
5 seconds, John.
Do you have $3.2 billion you can give the community? Yeah, very quickly. First of all, those bonds were bought because they were all insured with essentially no due diligence. It went to the community. The community had $3.2 billion to play with. 21 people ended up in jail because of corruption and passing the money around. It's the worst thing that could happen to the industry. What we need to do is build up confidence in this industry that the money that we raise is going to go to infrastructure. And that was probably the worst thing possible. Ultimately, the creditors took a $2 billion hit to make the thing work.
Thank you, Manu. Thank you, audience. Thank you, panelists. Ask these guys questions at the break.
Can I get that? Yes.